In 1987, a worker in the Philippines pulled a strange piece of metal from the ground. At first, it looked like nothing more than scrap, but when he unfolded it, he discovered something impossible. The surface was covered with writing, and the date on that writing was almost 1,000 years old, 900 AD. The text mentioned people, places, debts, and political authorities that existed in the Philippines centuries before Spanish colonization. And suddenly, historians were forced to reconsider what they thought they knew about the ancient Philippines. Because this wasn't a legend. It wasn't a later Spanish account. It was a document created by the people who actually lived there, and it had survived for more than 9 centuries. But there was a problem. The document didn't tell us everything. It gave us names. It gave us places. It gave us a glimpse of a political world. But the kingdom behind that world seemed to have disappeared. This is the mystery of the lost kingdom of Laguna. The story begins not in a royal palace, but in the province of Laguna. In 1987, a laborer was working near the mouth of a river in Lumban. During the process of dredging sand, he discovered a small rolled piece of copper. It didn't immediately look important. There was no treasure chest, no monumental tomb, no royal inscription announcing the name of a great king, just a thin sheet of metal. But when the worker flattened it, something appeared. Lines of writing. The object was eventually passed to an antique dealer. And several years later, in 1990, the National Museum of the Philippines acquired it. What the museum had acquired wasn't simply an old piece of metal. It was something far more unusual. A written document from the Philippines dating to approximately 900 AD. And that changed everything. The date is one of the first things that makes the Laguna copperplate so important. The inscription gives a date in the Saka calendar, 822. That corresponds to 900 AD. Think about what that means. This was more than 600 years before Magellan reached the Philippines. More than 500 years before Spanish colonization. Yet somebody in this region was producing a formal written document. And it wasn't written in isolation. The writing itself tells us something. The inscription uses a form of Kawi script, a writing tradition associated with the Indonesian world. Its language is primarily connected with Old Malay, while also containing Sanskrit and other linguistic elements. So the first mystery appears. If this document was created in the Philippines, why was its language connected to a much larger Southeast Asian world? For a long time, popular ideas about ancient Philippine history could create the impression of isolated communities developing separately from the rest of Asia. The copperplate tells a different story. The National Museum considers the inscription evidence of maritime connections between the Philippines and other parts of Southeast Asia. And the 2022 academic study by Elsa Clave and Arlo Griffiths pushes this even further. They place the inscription within a broader maritime network involving Luzon, Java, and the Malay world. That means the world of 900 AD wasn't divided into neat modern countries. People, languages, ideas, and legal practices moved across the sea. The Philippines was part of that network, and the copperplate gives us a rare glimpse into it. But what does the document actually say? This is where the story gets unexpectedly ordinary. The copperplate isn't a declaration of war. It isn't a royal prophecy. It is essentially a legal document concerning debt clearance. Someone named Namorin and his descendants were being released from a debt obligation. That may sound mundane, but that's exactly why the document is so valuable. Because ordinary legal paperwork can reveal things that royal monuments don't. It tells us that people had debts. There were authorities capable of recognizing those debts. There were legal relationships. There were people who could be released from financial obligations. And there was a system sophisticated enough to record the decision on metal. So this tiny copperplate is effectively a surviving piece of legal bureaucracy from 900 AD. And then things become much more interesting. Because the document names places. One of the most important names appearing in discussions of the inscription is Tondo. Today, Tondo is a district of Manila, but the document places the name in a much older political context. That means the region around modern Manila wasn't simply an empty landscape waiting for European colonization. There were established political centers. There were authorities. There were relationships between communities. And there was a world of commerce and law. The researchers studying the LCI emphasize precisely this point. It provides rare information about the social world of the Manila region before the Spanish period. But Tondo wasn't the only name. The inscription mentions several other places whose exact historical identities and relationships have been debated. And that's where the mystery begins. Imagine finding a 1,100-year-old legal document. It names cities. It names political authorities. It describes a transaction. But some of the places mentioned no longer have obvious modern equivalents. That's the situation with parts of the Laguna copperplate. Researchers have proposed different interpretations for several geographical names and their relationships. Some connections are plausible. Others remain uncertain. And this is important, because it means we can't simply draw a map and declare, this was the lost kingdom of Laguna. The evidence doesn't justify that certainty. What the evidence does show is more fascinating. There was a politically organized and internationally connected world in and around Luzon in 900 AD. But we are still reconstructing exactly how that world worked. One of the most intriguing elements is the relationship with Java. The inscription script belongs to the Kawi tradition associated with Java. Its linguistic composition also reflects the broader Southeast Asian environment. And modern research specifically examines the connection between 10th century Luzon, Java, and the Malay world. This doesn't mean that the Philippines was simply a colony of Java. That's an important distinction. The evidence instead points toward a cosmopolitan maritime environment. People and ideas moved. Languages influenced one another. Legal and administrative practices crossed borders. And political centers interacted. The sea wasn't necessarily a barrier. It was a highway. And now we reach the central question. If this document reveals a complex political world, where is the kingdom? The honest answer is, we don't have enough evidence to identify one single kingdom of Laguna in the way a modern viewer might imagine. The phrase is useful as a documentary hook, but the actual historical picture is more complicated. The copperplate gives us fragments. Tondo, other place names, political authorities, a legal dispute, a debt, connections across Southeast Asia. But the larger political map has to be reconstructed from scattered evidence. And that may actually make the story more interesting. Because we're not looking at the ruins of a kingdom with a giant sign telling us who built it. We're looking at a tiny surviving document and trying to reconstruct the world that produced it. The most important question isn't necessarily why did the kingdom disappear? It may be why do we know so little about this world? One reason is simple. Written records from the pre-colonial Philippines are extremely rare. The 2022 academic study describes the Laguna copperplate as one of the very few surviving historical documents from the pre-colonial Philippines. Think about the problem. A civilization can exist for centuries. It can trade, build settlements, create political institutions, develop writing. And yet if its documents don't survive, centuries later, historians may have almost nothing to work with. One copperplate suddenly becomes incredibly important, not because it tells the entire story, but because it proves there was a story. And perhaps that's the real mystery of Laguna. The discovery didn't simply give historians another artifact. It challenged an entire mental picture. The Philippines of 900 AD was not an isolated world disconnected from the rest of Asia. The evidence points toward maritime networks stretching across Southeast Asia. It shows writing, legal transactions, political authorities, debt relationships, and connections involving Luzon, Java, and the wider Malay world. And all of that information survived on something smaller than a sheet of paper, a piece of copper. For more than 900 years, the document remained hidden. Then, in 1987, somebody pulled it from the ground. And suddenly, a voice from 900 AD could speak again. Not the voice of an emperor, not a legendary warrior, not a mythical kingdom, but the voice of an ordinary legal transaction. A debt was cleared, names were recorded, places were mentioned, and without anyone intending it, the document preserved a snapshot of a world that would eventually become almost invisible. Maybe that's what makes the lost kingdom of Laguna so fascinating. We may never recover an entire lost kingdom from the ground. We may never know exactly how every political center mentioned in the inscription was connected, but we have something perhaps even more valuable. Proof that the world was there. And somewhere beneath the landscapes of Southeast Asia, there may still be more pieces waiting to be found. Because sometimes history isn't lost. It's simply buried.